Welcome to the Chess Angle. This is not your typical chess podcast. If you're an amateur or club-level player, the Chess Angle is for you. Our content is aimed at busy adults who are serious about the game but have limited study time. Featured guests include both amateur and titled players alike. And now, here's your host, director of the Long Island Chess Club, Neil Bellon.
Welcome, everyone. Thanks for tuning in. And this is our 60th episode, which is pretty remarkable. I don't know if that is some kind of milestone, but more than a flash in the pan. So I'm pretty happy about that. And that is, of course, thanks to all of you. Appreciate you listening. Appreciate all the kind words. Many of you already sent a few suggestions in for future episodes. For those of you who didn't catch last week's episode, if you have a question for me or a suggestion for an episode topic, something that you would like discussed, you can email me at info@thechessangle.com or hit me up on Twitter at thechessangle. I'll definitely review and consider all suggestions. I can't promise it'll be used, but I received 2 or 3 good suggestions already, so I really appreciate it. And that's a win-win for everybody, because for you as the listeners, it shows me or tells me that it's a topic that you're interested in and that I should talk about. So it benefits you, and then it benefits me, partly selfishly, because then I don't have to think of a topic or go through the stress of wondering, is this something that people are going to want to hear about? So I really do appreciate that. Now, this is my first book review in quite some time. I haven't had a book review episode in a while. And I only like to review books that have pragmatic instructional value for improvers and amateur players. I don't really review books where it's about the aesthetics and, this book is beautiful or this is a great game collection. Don't get me wrong, those books are great, but I try to focus on instructional material that's really going to help your game and that's going to fill the gaps in your knowledge. And again, that's really pragmatic as far as chess improvement. And the reason I say that, and this is something I've mentioned before, with the new crop of adult improvers that we have out there, because of this chess boom that we're going through, many are reading books or doing courses online that are too difficult for them, or they're jumping into advanced material without mastering the basics, and then their study plan is disjointed. Like they'll look at some complicated book or an advanced book on attacking where they still haven't mastered basic tactics yet. And like I said, the studying becomes disjointed as a result. And when you look at advanced material that's not appropriate for you, your study plan becomes a little bit, like I said, disjointed, and you have difficulty improving. So if you're finding yourself sort of stagnating, that could be why. And this book goes through a lot of the basics. So the book I'm referring to, of course, is The Complete Book of Chess Strategy by I.M. Jeremy Silman, who I'm a fan of. He's probably the best, or at least one of the best instructional writers for amateur players. Now, this book came out in 1998, so it's about 25 years old at the time of this recording. However, I feel it's still relevant, and I do consider this to be the best, or at least one of the best, all-in-one reference books for club players. And the thing with this book, it's not so much something that you're going to read from cover to cover. It's really a reference book. If there's something you want to look up, something about pawn structures, you can look it up. If there's an opening you want to look up, you can do it that way. You can read through it, but like I said, it's really a reference book. It gives you a basic definition, basically, of whatever it is you're looking up. And then if you want to learn more about that specific aspect of the game, you can look at a course or find another book that goes through that in detail. For example, you could look up something about pawn structures in this book, and then if that's something you want to learn more about or you need help with, you can then find a book or a course that deals just with pawn structures, that type of thing. As with all book reviews, I'm going to give a general introduction. I'm going to read through the table of contents, and then I'll dive into a few specific chapters. I don't want this to be me just, reading pages of the book, just reciting that's going to get a little dry. I'm going to do a deep dive into some of the more important chapters, like some highlights, so to speak. So again, this is a reference book, but you can read it through from cover to cover, but it's not really designed for that. It's very thorough. Okay. It covers all aspects of the game, the opening, the middle game, the end game, and some things related to chess psychology and the thought process as well. So it's very thorough. As with all of Silman's books, the prose is outstanding. It's very clear, easy to understand. He writes it in plain English. This book is for anyone rated below 2,000, I would say, especially if you're under 1,500. Technically, players of all levels can probably get something out of it. And this is a book I definitely feel you should have on your shelf or your tablet or your Kindle. It's available electronically as well. I will link it up in the show notes. So let's start by reviewing the table of contents. So let's start with the table of contents. It's divided into 4 parts, this book. Okay, part 1 is the opening. Part 2 is the middle game, which is really kind of a specialty for Silman. That's really where most of his contribution to the literature comes into play, is the middle game. I mean, although he's written about the end game as well, don't get me wrong, his end game book is fantastic, but his main sort of claim to fame with his thinking patterns and his use of the imbalances comes from the middle game. So you have part 1 is the opening, once again, part 2 is the middle game, part 3, of course, is the end game, and then part 4 is practical matters, things like chess psychology. So let's take a look, general look that is, at the table of contents at some of the chapters. So for the opening in part 1, he talks about basic opening strategy, castling development, and then most of it is actual openings. Now, it is a little bit dated as far as maybe some of the modern theory, but as far as understanding the most common chess openings on a basic level, it does a great job. And he lists them in alphabetical order. Most of the openings you can think of are on here. Like he has Albin counter gambit, Alekhein's defense, Benko gambit. So he goes in order. Of course, there's the Caro-Kann, the French, the Sicilian. And what he does is he gives like a 1 to 3 page sort of explanation. That's really what he devotes, I should say, about 1 to 3 pages to each opening. Like I said, it's almost like a dictionary, Wikipedia type of entry, but he explains it very well. And even though these opening explanations are very broad and sort of condensed, it's just an overview, there's still a lot of good information, right? So if you want to just understand the basics of the Caro-Kann defense, you can turn to that page in this book, kind of get a basic idea. And if that's something you want to explore in detail, you could then get a book or a course just on that defense, that type of thing. Now, he does mention the London system. Of course, I had to bring that up, but he calls it the boring opening. And then in parentheses, it says the reversed London system. So I'm not sure where that title came from. It's basically the London, but what he does, and I'll talk more about this in a little bit, he actually shows how to use the London system in a positional way against the King's Indian by black. So we'll talk about that. So that's kind of cool if you're a London player. Then he has the Kali, the Czech, the Dutch defense. Like I said, most of the mainstream openings are on here, but he even has the Grob. He has the Grunfeld, the Orangutan. I'm looking at all these, the Tory attack, Trompowsky, Veresov's opening. It's pretty thorough. It's very cool. And what I like about it is that it's nice to have in one book just sort of a condensed explanation of all of the different chess openings, or at least most of them. All right. And then he talks about preparation and reversed openings, that type of thing. And then there are quizzes at the end of each chapter as well. Now, part 2 is the middle game, which is Silman's main thing. He talks about attacks on the enemy king, opposite side castling. He has all of the tactical and combinational themes like clearance, sacrifice, decoy, deflection, fork, double attack, all that stuff. He talks about kingside focal points when attacking, the attack against h7, g7, f7, all those things. He talks about mating nets, and he has all of the common mating patterns. Like these are typical ideas of how, you can checkmate your opponent, like Anastasia's mate, back rank mate, Blackburn's mate, Damiano's mate, all those different things. So all of those basic ideas are in here. So like I said, it's very, very thorough. And then he talks about middle game themes such as blockading, centralization, closed and open positions, counterplay, initiative, the minority attack, all that stuff. And then he gets into minor pieces. Now, the battle of the minor pieces, making your minor pieces, your knights and bishops, better than your opponents and being aware of whose minor pieces are better. That's a very important concept. A lot of improvers are unaware of that. So he explains that. And he talks about open files, overprotection. Like I said, it's all here. Pawn structure, he explains everything. Backward pawns, doubled pawns, isolated pawns, pawn tension. And it goes on to some other topics. There's middle game quizzes. And then the end game section is next. That's part 3. I'm going to mention some specific chapters in a moment, but he talks about minor pieces in the end game, passed pawns in the end game, using the king. He talks about king and pawn versus king, the opposition, all that stuff. That's crucial. That's one of the chapters I'm going to do a deep dive into in a moment. He talks about using the rooks, Lucina's position, Philidor's position. I have some thoughts on those that I'll get into in a moment. And then part 4, which I love, is practical matters. Now, this section alone might be worth the price of the book. Although I shouldn't say that because, everything in the book is great. But he talks about blunders, draw offers, point count, psychology, time pressure, things of that nature. Think about it. What is chess improvement about? You need to deal with the opening, the middle game, the end game, and these practical matters. That's a bit of an oversimplification, but that's really what it's all about. And that's what this book deals with. So that gives you an overview of the content in a general sense. So what I'd like to do now is to highlight some specific chapters that I feel are particularly instructional. So let's do that. So what I'm going to do now is briefly highlight some of the more important chapters and the more important concepts based on my own experience as a TD, as an amateur player, and as someone who runs a chess club where I notice a lot of the same mistakes being repeated over and over. So I'm injecting a little bit of my own bias because I'm kind of cherry picking the chapters that I feel are most important and that I think most people will benefit from. So let's look at part 1, the opening first. He has a chapter called Basic Opening Strategy. And what he does, he explains that opening principles or your opening strategy, it's not just about developing your pieces, just simply getting them off the original squares. You need to develop, your pieces with a purpose based on, what's happening in the center. So he says, and this is a quote, for example, if you as white get to advance your pawns to d4 and e4, while your opponent places his pawns on d6 and e6, you will enjoy a spatial plus. You would then develop your forces in such a manner as to highlight this advantage. Another typical example centers around black playing bishop c8 to g4 takes knight on f3. This common exchange creates an imbalance of bishop versus knight. As soon as this appears on the board, white would place his pieces and pawns on squares that highlight the powers of his bishops. Black, on the other hand, would play for a closed position, which is known to favor knights, and would try hard to create advanced support points that would ultimately enable his horses to become equal or superior to the enemy bishops. So that's just an example of some things he discusses in the book about basic opening strategy. It's not just about getting your pieces sort of mindlessly off their original squares, but having your pieces develop around a specific imbalance or some type of positional aspect that you created. All right, so your pieces need to work in harmony. So he talks about that a great deal. Now, for his section on openings, where he actually lists all of the main openings, he has the London system, the Sicilian, the Ruy Lopez, all the mainstream openings. But I kind of want to highlight the way he talks about the London system. He calls it the boring opening. And I just think it's interesting because if you play it, he explains a way to use it to meet the king's Indian defense, by black. and he shows you how to play it in a positional way. Because lately, a lot of people, myself included, they'll use the Jabava London, which works very well against Black's King's Indian defense. But this is a more traditional positional way to use the London system against the King's Indian. And if you're a positional player like me, if you sort of like those more strategic positions, this is an excellent explanation. And he talks about Black's main ideas when facing the London when he plays the King's Indian. Black will play for queenside space with c7, c5. That's one idea. Another idea is the Queen b6 themes, where he tries to pinpoint b2 as a weakness. He talks about where Black plays for knight c6 to put pressure on d4. And then he talks about where Black tries to play for e7, e5. It's all these ideas against the London using the King's Indian defense, and he explains it very well. So again, if you're a London player, that's something you may want to check out. So now moving to the second section on the middle game, a very important chapter is on the combination themes. He discusses all the main tactical ideas: clearance, sacrifices, decoy, deflection. These are basic tactical patterns that you absolutely have to know. You just have to know these. You have to be able to see them. You have to be able to set them up. You have to be able to play against them when your opponent's trying to use them on you. You have to defend. This is very, very important stuff. And going back to what I said in the intro, I think a lot of players are looking at advanced attacking material, or they're analyzing Grandmaster games with these advanced attacking themes when they haven't even mastered this material themselves. So this is very, very important stuff. You're not going to sort of master this and learn everything you're going to need to just from this book, but this will absolutely get you started. And it's a good reference. It's a good guide just to kind of give you an overview. And then, of course, you can look at whatever videos, courses, do a lot of puzzles to improve your tactical vision. This is just so important. But what I like about this book, he basically explains all of the main ideas that you need to know. Another thing that he explains are these kingside focal point attacks. He gives you the basics of attacking all of the sort of important squares by your opponent's king, attacks against h7, g7, f7, and g6. He explains it on a very basic level. So you'll have an idea of when to know, okay, yes, I should attack this square, or whether there's really nothing there and it just seems that way. He goes through all that because there are certain positional triggers and things to look for that tell you that you should attack. He explains all that. He talks about attacking the dark squared complex on f6, g7, and h6. Really, really a great, great overview. And then also just as crucial is the section on the mating patterns. You simply have to know this stuff. Anastasia's mate, back rank mate, Blackburn's mate, Greco's mate, Morphy's mate, all these different patterns. You simply have to know it. Now, the back rank mate, which most of you probably know, back rank is simply like you move your rook on your opponent's back rank and it's checkmate, right? Because his king has nowhere to go. But those type of back rank ideas are very important because even in more advanced games against stronger club players, many tactics are based off of a back rank mate or a threat or that type of tactic. I mean, I've had plenty of games at the club against, 16, 17, 1800 players where I won a piece or a pawn or got a major positional advantage because they had a weak back rank. I mean, that's something that happens at all levels. So you need to know these patterns. Very, very important stuff. Also in this section, he talks about candidate moves and the imbalances, which is, Silman's main thing, his whole system of the imbalances. If you read The Amateur's Mind, which he also wrote, you know how I feel about that book. I think it's the most important instructional book out there. He talks about that in detail. Now, the imbalances, basically what that means, those are the differences between the respective positions. So when you look at a position from an imbalances point of view, you're understanding the differences in the position and as a result, what your responsibilities are on the board. So his imbalances are material, space, pawn structure, superior minor piece, lead in development, and initiative. All right. And his whole thing is that by understanding the imbalances, you can then come up with the correct plan. So he gives an introduction to that idea. He also talks about closed and open positions and about how the location of the center pawns determine whether a position is open or closed. He explains how to play those because a lot of players get confused as far as coming up with a plan when the position is open or closed. He explains that in detail, so I won't go into it now. He then explains the minority attack, which is very important. It's an important positional idea that you need to know about. It's basically where you attack a majority of pawns with a minority of pawns. And then the idea is that you hope to create weaknesses and holes and open files in your opponent's position. So he explains that very well. And then he also talks about, as I mentioned earlier, minor pieces and the battle between the minor pieces, how bishops work, how knights work, what types of positions that each of those pieces prefers, making your minor pieces better than your opponent's. And that whole idea, as I mentioned in the intro, understanding the differences between your minor pieces and your opponent's and whose is stronger, that whole thing, very, very important because a lot of improvers, it's something that they're not aware of or they don't think about it enough. So he explains that in detail. Then he goes into pawn structure very thoroughly, backward pawns, isolated pawns, doubled pawns, all of those things he explains. Now, his section on the endgame has some great, great stuff. And what I'm going to do at the end is I'm going to give you my own sort of off-the-record opinion about the endgame at the amateur level. So just hold that thought for a minute, or I'm going to hold that thought for a minute. But let's talk about what's in the book. Now, the first concept he talks about, or one of the first concepts in the chapter, is cat and mouse, which I've spoken about before. I did an episode on waiting moves, and I spoke about that. I spoke about how not every move has to have this like amazing purpose. And if you're not sure, a lot of the times you can just kind of like shuffle a bishop or something and your opponent's going to collapse. It's basically a waiting move. It's almost like a way of passing. Like, I don't want to move right now. I think both of us, neither of us know really what to do. So I'm just going to play this harmless, innocuous move that doesn't really change anything. And I'm going to see what you do. And then very often your opponent tries too hard to win. Right. So as you know, I did a whole episode on waiting moves. You can look that up. But Silman has this thing he calls cat and mouse. And I know this is something that Magnus does very well. It's basically the idea that you can take several moves to do what could have been done in one or two. Usually you do this in positions where you have a little bit of an advantage. The opponent is helpless. And the idea is to get him off guard or lazy. So in other words, as I said, you kind of take several moves to do what you could do in a few moves, and then you end up evoking a mistake because you kind of mask your plans and you give the opponent the feeling that you're not sure what to do, and that can get them off guard. All right, so it's similar to my idea of just playing a waiting move, but this cat and mouse, it's just a way of being very, very patient, especially in a position where you might be slightly better, or even if the position is equal. You basically allow your opponent to sort of hang himself on the chessboard and make a mistake. So he explains it in the book probably a lot better than I just did, but I think you get the idea. So that's cat and mouse. And then he talks about exchanging, which is such an important concept in all phases of the game. But basically, he says that you don't want to mindlessly trade pieces. This is something I've spoken about on the podcast. You really need to analyze exchange sequences. And he talks in this section about not trading mindlessly and really thinking about what the position is going to look like when the trades are finished. Is this trade helping you? Like, are you trading a knight that's really well positioned for no reason, just because you're not sure what to do? I'm just going to trade pieces when that knight should have stayed where it was. But he talks about exchanging, when you should exchange, when not to exchange, how sometimes it might be good to sacrifice the exchange, that type of thing. He talks about that in detail. He goes on to discuss passed pawns in the endgame, which is what it's all about. He talks about it in queen endgames and outside passed pawns, promotion and under promotion. Now, when you have queen and pawn endings, which can be very tricky, almost annoying, because those queen and pawn endings, those can be wild because you got to watch out for checks and forks and perpetual check. But in a queen endgame, those passed pawns are crucial because usually in a queen and pawn ending, whoever has a passed pawn will usually win because the defending side, has to deal with defending his own king, but also has to deal with the passed pawn. Now, perhaps the most important chapter in this book, at least in the endgame section, is using the king. You have to know this. You absolutely have to know this. Now, we can argue about endgame knowledge, because there's a lot of theories. You need to know this. You don't need to know that. The endgame is extremely important. The endgame is overrated at the amateur level. All these different things. But as far as I'm concerned, using the king, the basics of king and pawn endings, king and pawn versus king, the opposition, the square of the pawn, triangulation, all these things you absolutely have to know. That alone is probably 40 to 50% of all endgame knowledge, or is the theory related to king and pawn versus king in the opposition. You simply have to know that because at all levels, you're going to have king and pawn endings. You're going to see king and pawn endings in advanced games, obviously, because those go to the end game quite often. But even in lower rated games, a lot of times the players just trade down, and you simply have to understand those king and pawn endings, how to penetrate with your king using triangulation, knowing when trading down into a king and pawn ending is going to be better for you. You simply have to know that stuff. And he has a whole chapter on it, using the king. Obviously, you can use other resources to study it in detail, but I can't emphasize this enough. Again, king and pawn versus king, those basic ideas, opposition, triangulation, and sort of like these saving pawn moves, like knowing when to maybe sack a pawn and then you get a passed pawn. All those king and pawn ending ideas, you have to know, because regardless of what level you're at, regardless of the strength of your opponent, you're going to find those positions. And I can tell you, with the club level, those king and pawn endings are often decisive. Like, that often determines who the better player is and who wins. I've had so many opponents who played a fantastic game, the entire game, regardless of their rating, but I can tell in the end game, their knowledge kind of slips a little bit, or they get impatient. They'll do an impatient trade, like they'll trade their bishop for my knight, and then we're down to just king and pawns, and I end up winning because they think, oh, it's an equal trade, but they didn't analyze. They didn't see that when they trade, my king is now better, I'm going to win. And that's all it takes. Like, those king and pawn endings, one tempo, that's it. One tempo, one square, you're done. So that chapter is very, very important. The king and pawn versus king, again, the opposition, triangulation, square of the pawn. I know I'm repeating myself. You have to know that. We can debate other aspects of the end game, but that stuff you simply have to know. It's just too important and it's too common. Now, Silman has a section on using the rooks, and he talks about having an active rook, how rooks belong behind passed pawns, all that stuff. But there's a couple of things about this chapter that I sort of disagree with, but this is more about a disagreement about endgame theory in general. And he mentions two positions that you've likely heard of, which is Lucéna's position and Philidor's position. And I'm going to say something that I might get some blowback from, or I might get some pushback, which is, I think knowing Lucéna and Philidor's position is important. You have to know it, but I think it's overrated. And I think for many beginners or advanced beginners, Lucéna and Philidor's position is kind of like dessert. It's nice, but it's not necessary. And why do I say that? You'll spend a lesson with your grandmaster coach learning the Lucéna's position or Philidor's position, and then you go to the club and you end up dropping a pawn on move 3, or you end up hanging a knight. You need to know these positions, yes, but what I'm saying is it's not the type of thing where, okay, drop everything now and learn these. It's not the type of thing where the reason that you're 1,200 and you're struggling to get to, say, 1,400 is because you don't know Lucena and Philidor's position. That's probably not why. You probably have bigger fish to fry. Let's talk about these briefly, what they are. The Lucena's position, it's a rook and pawn theoretical ending where you have a king, rook, and pawn, and your opponent just has a king and a rook. And it's a method by which you queen the pawn. Usually your king is on the queening square if you're the stronger side, and you sort of build a bridge with your rook and you end up queening the pawn. You do need to know it. I'm not going to explain it in an audio podcast. I'm just simply saying that, your overall improvement and improving to great lengths as a player is not going to rest upon whether you know Lucena's position. We've had experts at the club, not making this up. We've had more than one expert at the club where some beginners were discussing this and they were like, what's Lucena's position? I mean, they're easily getting to 2,000, not even knowing what it is. And then you also have Philidor's position, which is similar. This time you're the defending side. This is where you're the defending side and your king is in front of the pawn that's trying to queen. And it's sort of a blockading endgame where you can force a draw. All right, so that's Philidor's position and Lucena's position, which again, you do need to know them. Don't interpret this as, I'm not saying they're not important. I'm not saying you don't need to learn them. What I'm saying is, I think they're two of the most overrated positions in all of chess at the amateur level, because most problems that you're going to face and most areas of improvement and most weaknesses in your game are going to occur way before you get to these. So yes, you do need to know them. Absolutely. But what I'm saying is it's not the type of thing where you need to rush and do it right now. You can get to it when you get to it. Like I said, I know I'm going to get some pushback from that, but I firmly believe that. What you definitely need to know, what you should sort of like drop everything and learn now, or what I mentioned earlier, the king and pawn versus king theory, right? King and pawn versus king and the triangulation, opposition, all that stuff. That you need to know. Philidor and Lucena's position you can get to. All right, but it's not this earth-shattering thing that you have to know like right this second. So one thing I want to say about the endgame in general, if you remember before, I said I was going to kind of make an off-the-record comment about endgames. So again, I'm basing this on my own experience as a player, as a TD who's seen, dozens and dozens, probably hundreds of amateur games. Very often at the amateur level, the endgame is so imbalanced with one player clearly having an advantage that a lot of these advanced theoretical endgame sort of theory or these advanced endgame patterns aren't necessary. Like I said, it's for the reason that one side usually clearly has an advantage. And I remember reading an article in Chess Life many, many years ago. I think I referenced this in an earlier podcast episode where, this chess coach wrote this article for Chess Life. It might have been a titled player, but he was saying that in his opinion, advanced endgame study is somewhat overrated at the amateur level for the reason I just stated, that, most of the time, one player is clearly going to be much better than the other, and the right plan is sort of obvious. Like they'll either be up material and queening a pawn is pretty straightforward, or they'll have a passed pawn, or they'll just have, such a positional advantage. So just something to think about as far as endgames at the amateur level. And I question whether a lot of these obscure, sort of highly advanced, unusual endgame positions are really of practical value, and whether or not, you can spend your time doing other things. That's just sort of my own editorial opinion on endgames at the amateur level. All right, the last section of the book is called Practical Matters. And I think for amateurs and improvers, this is so important, because if you don't address these practical matters that he discusses, all of the other theoretical knowledge, like from the previous chapters, as far as the opening, middle game, and end game, that stuff really won't matter if these practical matters are an issue, or, it could be causing you to stagnate. It could be preventing your improvement, because even though you have the theoretical knowledge, it's not translating on the board because you have these other issues. So he starts out by talking about blunders, why we blunder and what you can do to prevent them. And he talks about recurring patterns and identifying those and eliminating these weaknesses in your game. Because the truth is, for most of us at the amateur level, we have these weaknesses or bad habits that we just can't break, or we have trouble. So it doesn't matter how much more knowledge we gain. If you don't break these bad habits, you're going to have trouble improving. So he talks about that. Then he talks about draw offers, where I kind of disagree with him a little bit. Now, I kind of said, yeah, I'm going to start doing that, never take draws. I mean, the truth is, I think I'm better at holding off on accepting a draw unless I feel it's necessary. But I still do believe, if I'm being honest, that offering or accepting a draw in the long run, like knowing when to do that, can really help your rating in the long term. I truly believe that. Like the idea of never, ever offering or accepting a draw, I'm not quite sold on that. I mean, I'm sold on playing on more than I used to. And I think I'm definitely better at it. I no longer reflexively accept a draw, but I still think it's wrong to say that you should never offer or accept a draw. I think in certain situations, it can be the smart move. Maybe you're not feeling well. Maybe you're tired. Maybe you're getting nervous. There might be some situations where accepting the draw makes sense. So like I said, I'm not completely sold on the idea that you should never offer a draw. I'm not quite at that point. I don't know if I ever will be, but Silman does believe that at the amateur level that you should play on and not accept the draw. And, I respect that. And there's a lot to be said for that theory. But like I said, I'm not quite sold on it. You can read all about his, beliefs on draw offers. He talks about it at length. And then he goes on to chess psychology. There's a section on that. He talks about always expecting your opponent to play the best move and not to get freaked out by opponents with higher ratings, things of that nature. I'm not going to read it down, but he does talk about chess psychology. He talks about time pressure and how to avoid it. And then he gives some quizzes on these practical matters. So basically, blunders, draw offers. He talks also about point count versus material and psychology and time pressure. Again, this is just an overview. You're not going to know everything you need to about chess psychology and practical matters from this book, but he does give you some things to think about. So again, this is Silman's complete book of chess strategy. It's on Amazon. I mean, it's pretty much everywhere. I'll put a link in the show notes. Fantastic book, fantastic sort of all-in-one or, one and done reference book for improvers. I think it's an important book to have. And I like the fact that even though it's not in depth, he kind of covers, or at least mentions, pretty much everything you kind of need to know as far as opening, middle game, end game, and these other practical matters, because putting that all together and, plugging the holes where you're weak, that's really what it's all about. So it's a fantastic book. Check it out. I highly recommend it. And as always, I really appreciate you listening, and I hope you win your next game. Have a great day, everybody.